So, Ben, let me turn to you. So, when assets are damaged or disrupted by conflicts like the one that we're seeing, what are the first legal considerations companies should be making in those first hours, first days? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, good question. And I think, I'll cover these at a high level. I think each of which could probably be its own full, hour-long conversation or more. But I think first thing you should be thinking of, especially if you have damaged assets, should be evidence preservation and site control issues, because that's going to have implications both for potential affirmative claims, insurance claims, things of that nature. But also if you are in a situation where you may have defensive claims where you may be getting sued or have a risk of being sued by potentially people who were injured in an event or potentially, commercial claims related to inability to perform, you're going to want to make sure that your evidence is preserved, and that needs to happen from the very beginning of an event. And that's going to cover everything from physical evidence, of course, to electronic data, emails, text messages, Teams messages, all of that stuff needs to be preserved. Employee information, so you need to be talking to your folks to figure out who, you know, was there, saw things, knows things, making sure you're documenting that information. And also looking at third parties. Do you have contractors at the site who are going to need to get information from? Do you have process data that needs to be maintained? Turning off auto delete, things of that nature. So that all needs to be kind of happening and hopefully part of a plan that you already have in place that can then be implemented when an event occurs. Another kind of separate thing to be thinking about are your contractual obligations. Obviously, everyone on this call works at a company who I'm sure has, relationships with other companies and has obligations to supply a service, supply a product. And is this incident going to impact your ability to do that because perhaps you've lost access to a critical component of your manufacturing process, or there is a supply chain interruption based on what's occurred? And so in that situation, you should be looking at your contracts to understand, are there notices that need to be provided to to your customers in a timely fashion, and then also looking at potential force majeure rights that you may have. So force majeure is a common thing that you see in a contract that's going to allocate risk whenever one of the parties cannot perform. And so hopefully, as part of your planning for incidents, you have in place a process whereby the right folks in your legal team are looking at that to assess, is this a scenario where we have an ability to claim force majeure? And if so, what kind of notices do we need to be providing to our customers in this situation? And as you would expect, and if anyone has looked at those force majeure provisions, acts of war are almost always listed, right, in force majeure. So certainly if you have a facility that's been physically impacted and you can't do some process that you would typically do, that you're in pretty firm territory there. But I think the trickier piece here is sort of for example, commodity price issues. That's something that can obviously have very material impact on performing under a contract because it may mean that the contract is no longer economical, but that's usually not a scenario where you can claim force majeure. So, it'll obviously be situation dependent, but you'll want to have kind of early discussions with your legal team to make sure that if you have those rights, you're exercising them in a thoughtful and timely way. And kind of separate, but on a similar track, another notice issue to be thinking about is your insurance carriers. If you work at a large enough organization, you're probably going to have an insurance team or function, and hopefully they can handle that reporting for you, look at the various insurance programs you have, identify which carriers need to be put on notice based on the circumstances. Um, but I think the key, if you're thinking at this from a management level, is to make sure that the folks who have that information, who know your insurance program, are looped into your plan from the beginning so that they're aware of what's going on and can be thinking through, who do we need to be getting notice to in time, so you can avoid some situation down the road where a carrier says, well, you didn't tell us about this, you didn't give us timely notice, and then you're in a fight about whether something's covered or not. And then finally, there's going to be a range of regulatory reporting obligations that should be thought about if you operate critical infrastructure. There's going to be numerous different reporting obligations there. If there are cybersecurity issues, and then there's also just kind of the generalized obligations for public companies to report material events through 8Ks that need to be considered as well in the timelines for doing that. And so we can break those down. But at a high level, I think those are some key things that organizations should be considering if they have a crisis event like what could occur in a situation we're currently dealing with.
Yeah, all important considerations. So, you talk about these responsibilities, and so I'm just curious, what documentation or evidence preservation measures should companies be taking early on when faced with significant conflicts like the one we have? Again, to help support all of those communications that you were just referencing.
Sure. So I think it'll depend on the nature of the event, obviously, and it's also going to depend on where your assets are. So if to give an example, let's say you have assets in the US that have been impacted by like a cyber attack, right? Which there's been reports of attempts of doing that from Iranian aligned actors. So in that situation, you may need to coordinate with US regulatory authorities on what documentation needs to be maintained. And if you're in another jurisdiction, hopefully your personnel who are in that location and familiar with the jurisdiction can know whether or not there are similar regulatory programs that need to be involved in the evidence preservation process. And if there needs to be some kind of formalized agreement with those regulatory agencies as to the information that's going to be maintained and how it's going to be maintained. Another thing we talked about is physical assets. So this would come into play more in a situation where you have, physical damage to an asset and you need to document what happened there. And so one thing you should be looking at is whether or not you need to have an evidence custodian. So there are numerous companies that specialize in that. And if you have an incident of any size or complexity, that's certainly something you should be considering and bringing on because they can then sort of take that piece. I mean, you as a business leader obviously are going to have all these things to consider, and that's a nice thing to have is bringing an evidence custodian who can help you document the scene, identify the key pieces of evidence. If there's going to need to be an investigation as to exactly what happened, they can help start mapping that out to say these are the pieces of the equipment we're going to need to make that analysis. They can do the right documentation so that down the road that information is available and they can help you sort of store that evidence and that information in a way that allows you to use it as needed in future regulatory proceedings or other legal proceedings. Another big category is going to be electronic data. And I mentioned this briefly before, but that will cover all the things you would typically expect, emails, of course, but that's much broader now. Most companies obviously use Teams or Zoom, other chat functions. All of that needs to be preserved. Text messages for sure. That is now incredibly common in every case, right? Agencies want to see text messages. If you're in litigation, the other side will certainly want to see that stuff. So all of that needs to be preserved. But you also need to be thinking about process data. So if you have SCADA data or other types of data associated with the activity that was functioning at the site, and that may be relevant to the event, that sort of information needs to be preserved as well. And for those, you want to be careful because some of those systems have quicker triggers on overwriting the data. And so you want to make sure you're implementing your procedures quickly to ensure that stuff is being maintained. And as for things like emails, communications, getting out timely hold notices to relevant personnel to make sure they know that they individually have obligations to maintain information, to not delete emails, not delete texts. And again, obviously we want our employees to comply with that, but also from a organizational standpoint, that allows you to show that you're exercising the right level of care and the right level of diligence in dealing with this sort of incident. You also want to talk to your people, right? There may be folks who were at the location where an event occurred. They were involved in operating the asset. They may have information that is relevant. And so you're going to want to, one, identify who those people are, and two, talk to them fairly early on to understand what they know about the situation, what information they have, and where you, as management or whoever sort of overseeing the incident response, may have some blind spots in terms of where data or information may be. So those people are going to play a critical role. Third parties as well, we mentioned that before. And then the other kind of overlay to all this, I think, is coordination with legal counsel and making decisions on how much of these activities are going to be done through a privileged function versus how much of it is going to be done through a typical, kind of incident response process. And there are many, many considerations that go into making that decision. And there's no sort of one size fits all. And there may be different aspects of a response that you want to run through an operational lens, others through a legal lens. But I think the key from a planning standpoint is to make sure that your incident response plans have in place the right steps to ensure that legal is involved early on so that management and legal can be making informed decisions about how these different work streams should be run to best set your organization up to deal with responding to the incident, addressing regulatory obligations, and addressing potential legal claims down the road.